smonta tutto, il film non si fa più. Quei giorni qua non ci deve essere più niente, bisogna cominciare subito. Coraggio, al lavoro, buttate giù. Dico bene, autore?
Sì, grazie. Arrivederci, ragazzi. Ci vediamo in un prossimo film.
Lo speriamo.
Ciao, marinai.
Welcome to Cinema Italia, a podcast dedicated to the world of Italian cinema. Presented by me, John Bleasdale. And welcome to Cinema Italia. My name is John Bleasdale. This is the podcast that celebrates all things in Italian cinema, and I'm delighted to welcome Giulia Saccogna to the podcast, the curator of a new BFI season. Welcome, Giulia.
Thanks, John, for having me.
We're going to talk specifically about one of the most important films in Italian cinema, I think, Rome Open City, Roma Città Aperta by Roberto Rossellini. You'll have to correct my Italian as I go.
Sounds great so far.
This is a film I rewatched very recently, last night, in preparation for this episode. And my God, it's a masterpiece.
It is, isn't it? Yes. It's very, what I noticed watching it again is just that it's almost 80 years later, it still resonates incredibly, so relevant still today. And it really, you can see how and why it made had such an impact in worldwide cinema and still making waves for its role. It really broke with tradition, with the history of cinema in a major way. So it's really timeless, and I think that's why we're still here talking about it 80 years later.
Absolutely. Could you give us a sort of kind of like a précis, if you like, a synopsis of the film? So we don't have to worry about spoilers because I think...
we don't have to worry. Okay.
No, I think 80 years is enough time for us to talk about it as a film that's out there.
Okay. So, well, synopsis-wise, we could say that it's a story that set during the German occupation of Rome that lasted 9 months. It was a time of deprivation and hunger and oppression. And this specific film focuses on 4 main characters within this setting. There's a priest, Don Pietro. There's the couple that is about to be married, Francesco, a typographer, and Pina, a pregnant mother of 1 child. There's a communist, Manfredi, who's a resistance leader. And then there's a few secondary characters. We have the girlfriend of the communist leader, Marina, and the sister of Pina, who's called Lauretta, who are both showgirls. We have a Gestapo chief, Major Bergman, and his helper or spy called Ingrid, and a chorus of background characters. And throughout the film, basically we see Major Bergman, the Gestapo chief, trying to find Manfredi, the communist resistance leader, who's helped by the other working class characters, so by the priest, by Pina, and by Francesco, helped in his underground activities, eventually caught. And yeah, I don't know. I don't really feel like spoiling it for everybody, but yeah, it's
that's okay. Yeah, we don't have to spoil it. You're quite right. You're quite right.
So it's a tale of courage and resistance at a time of a very dark time in Italian history of occupation, and it very much draws on real stories of real characters that have merged into the script in a way that maybe we can talk about.
I mean, one thing that on rewatching it, I realized it's just how darkly ironic that title is as well. Rome, Open City.
Exactly.
I mean, it's begins with a raid and people running away and people having to have conversations in stairwells because there's nowhere safe in this city to talk.
Yeah, I thought maybe I could, I don't know how familiar listeners would be with the term open city, but so it's a term that was used in the actual surrender agreement that was signed with the Germans on the 8th of September 1943. So it meant basically that at that time, well, maybe I can go back a little bit with a little bit of history because it's really historical. So it needs, if people are not very familiar with the history of that specific time in Italian history, obviously, probably everybody knows that Italy started the Second World War on Germany's side, but then over the course of July 1943, there was a shift in Italy's position as Mussolini was voted out of power and was arrested. And the new prime minister called Pietro Badoglio started negotiation with the Allies. So hoping to spare Rome from this distraction, the new government declared it an open city. So in effect, it was supposed to be a demilitarized zone free from military activity. And after that was the word used in the agreement signed with the Germans. But obviously, the Germans completely flouted this agreement and almost immediately declared that Rome was a war zone where German laws operated. So then Badoglio and the king fled Rome for the south, and he left Italian citizens and armed forces to their own devices. And so the notion of Rome as an open city really came to have ironic connotations because the Germans marched in, took over, and then the bombs from the Allies began falling again. So, but it's also a very important notion because for those in the underground movement, it represented the sort of ideal to be restored, and it really underlined the illegality of the presence of the Germans. So during this 9 month occupation, it was, as I said, period like really dark and survival for many, collaboration for some, and resistance for a lot of the others, and torture, as you will see. But it really is an essential testimony of this time of occupation. And the population was very hostile. This armed resistance that we see in the film was very, very present in the real story. And initially were just really little guerrilla actions, but the resistance was responsible for many actions in Rome, including the shootings in retaliation of the killing of Teresa Gullace, who was the character that inspired Anna Magnani's character of Pina, and also the bomb attack, a very famous bomb attack in Via Rasella, which was an attack to which the Germans responded with the famous massacre called the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, which is very relevant for the film because the priest, one of the two priests that inspired the character of Aldo Fabrizi, was actually killed in this massacre. So much for not spoiling. I've actually already said it.
And that massacre was also, there was a film devoted to that called Massacre of Rome, or Massacre in Rome, with Richard Burton and Marcello Mastroianni. A long time later, obviously.
Yeah, I think it really needed that time to kind of for people to recover. Still now, it's quite fresh in Italian memory because for 33 Germans that were killed in the partisan attack, 335 Italians were killed. So 10 Italians per German plus 5 extra ones. So it's really something that pretty much every Italian would, maybe not the younger generation, but yeah, it's still very fresh in Italian memory. Probably some people still have family members that died then.
Well, I mean, there was a recent government minister who made very cavalier comments about the initial partisan attack, was called to account by several newspapers. So it's still to this day, it's in the news
ongoing,
in Italy.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing debate about did the partisans, how much we recognize the partisans as a part of Italian history and keeping that legacy and that part of history alive, which is becoming increasingly difficult given current Italian politics,
yes.
which we how much you want to get into. But,
yeah, probably not very much.
Yeah, we could skate over that for the moment. One of the things which you talking about this historical background brings to mind is how present large-scale history is in what seems to be an intimate story of, as you said, several individuals and characters. I was thinking about this when I was just thinking of these characters almost like as representatives of the social forces. So you have the communist, you have the priest, the church, you have, during an interrogation, he's asked the names of the generals of the monarchists as if
Badogliani, yes.
exactly as if that will split him. You know, you're not giving up communists, you're giving up the monarchists who you'll be fighting next. And it seems like this is a historical moment in which Italy is actually, perhaps after the trauma of fascism, trying to reconstitute itself as an alliance between these separate forces who are, you know, ideologically diverse, if not actually oppositional.
Yeah, I mean, it's a moment that really is quite unique because then soon after, everything changed really. But at that specific moment, it was such a chaotic time that I think even like all it was quite polarized, and you were either you're either a fascist or an anti-fascist, and in the anti-fascist side you really could have Catholics. Actually the people working on the film represent pretty much all the different sides. You have Rossellini, who was a Catholic. You could say maybe not deeply involved in religious, but he represented the Catholic side of Italy. You have Amidei, who was the scriptwriter, Sergio Amidei, who was an active communist. Actually, part of his personal stories become the stories of Manfredi. He actually lived through those. You have Alberto Consiglio, who was the writer of the treatment that the film started from. It was a treatment just about the priest. And he was a monarchist, or anyway, not against monarchy. So he was considered Badogliano. You have Fellini, who was completely not involved in politics at all, and he was just, but definitely anti-fascist, but not actively. So all these people could all be on the same side and work together toward, again, telling a story against the other side that was the occupier side. And this basically could, even if sorry, this is a little moment of hesitation.
That's okay.
I'm trying to think how to bring this together. What really changed after is basically what happened with the 1948 elections. So from that moment on, things changed. But up to that point, I think we still have a few years where Italian politics, everything was quite chaotic, but you could still have a moment where all these sides could be together against the occupier.
Yeah, that's sort of anti-fascism becomes the unifying factor which can unify all these people. There's also a sense, perhaps, in Rossellini's own biography that he has to lead up to this point, because prior to this film, during the fascist period, he is making films under the aegis of the fascist party and fascist-controlled Hollywood. In fact, fascist party was very important in the development of cinema in the pre-war period, including the establishment of the Venice Film Festival.
Yes, absolutely. Well, he was, if you really look into his biography, it was a bit contradictory, because really he was hanging out with Ed Daciano, like with the Duce people. He was there. He was making films together with Vittorio Mussolini's son, who was a film goer and a cinema enthusiast. He made all his first film under the fascist rule. So he made the first trilogy called the Trilogy of Fascist War, renamed now. So The White Sheep, A Pilot Returns, and The Man with the Cross. And these are stories of simple men that are victims. And Rossellini emphasizes in this film the suffering of the war. So you could say that his style was already a little bit present then, but yeah, these were fascist stories, and I guess he's completely the opposite of Sergio Amidei, who was his friend and the scriptwriter of many films after that. But of the two, surely he was, the one that mingled with the fascists.
The most compromised, if you like.
The most compromised, absolutely. He managed, though, afterwards, he did state that, the Roma Open City was a film of fear, of everyone's fear, even his own fear, because he also had to run away, he also had to hide, he also had friends that were killed and tortured. And yet, when you look at just the biography, you do wonder, how it's quite compromising, but also, people had to survive, people had to get through this, and there were different ways of doing it, actively fighting against it as an underground anti-fascist communist, or making films, using them, I guess, to learn his trade. And then most of actually, when you're talking about the professionals, most of the people that worked, cinematographers, editors, sound people, scriptwriters that worked in neorealist films and became the big names of neorealism, they all learned their skills and thanks to fascist Cinecittà. Basically, Cinecittà was ordered, like the building of Cinecittà was ordered by Mussolini in 1937. It was initially privately owned and then became the state. As you said, there was the Venice Film Festival. So all these people, it's a stereotype, a misconception that the people that worked in neorealism were all like amateur, that just grab the camera and go on the street and work with non-professional actors. They were very experienced people, and that's where they learned all their skills.
It's interesting you mentioned neorealism as this sort of like, when we hear the word realism today, we probably think of someone like Ken Loach or a certain documentary style. I find this film, and I find Italian neorealism in general, very much not a documentary style of filmmaking.
Not at all.
I mean, partly because of the hardware, you just couldn't have a handheld camera, which today represents that those just didn't exist from a technological point of view. What do you think are the components of neorealism, which this arguably is the first film?
Yeah, first, one thing about what you said about the documentary side. So yeah, one side is that everybody, when I started studying neorealism, you realize that there is a lot of that impression that is of the documentary style. And you could say that, for example, Paisa does include Rossellini's second film after Roma Open City, so the second one in the trilogy of war, of the anti-fascist war. So Roma Open City, Paisa, and Germany as Zero. In Paisa, there are newsreel extracts included, edited with the footage. So maybe that perhaps had a bit more of a documentary style. But if you think about Roma Open City, really, it's quite interesting to think that is trying to represent reality, but what it gives us is already is a version of reality. It's not real necessarily reality. It's showing. It wants us to hate the Germans, which, I mean, what else can you do? It wants us to have compassion for the other characters. So it's telling us already what to feel, basically. So it's not real. That's not what reality is. It's already a digested version of reality that then is given to us. So that's one side that is, I think, the first misconception, not for this one, but for also all the other neorealist film. So it's not, it can have a documentary style, but it's very far from being documentaristic. The other aspect are Zavattini, I can't talk about this without mentioning Zavattini. Cesare Zavattini was a scriptwriter that worked mostly with De Sica, and he's considered the theorist behind the neorealism, because he's the one that really said that the goal for these films that they were trying to do, it was to follow reality. So that's where the title of the program of Curated comes from, is chasing. So he calls it in Italian pedinamento della realtà. So like a following reality, like almost a tailing of reality. So he was the one with this ideal of like purest idea of neorealism. But actually, even his own films don't have that. Like his ideal film was, he stated famously, a film of 90 minutes of following a man going about with his business, which he also never, like, that doesn't exist, like there is obviously Umberto D with some scenes that follow the daily routine minute by minute, but that it's a utopic thing that doesn't actually exist. So obviously there are the theories just of Zavattini, really, and then there's the reality of the films, which we can say, I like to think about it not as neorealism, but as neorealisms. There's multiple. There's not a one movement. It never existed as one movement. It was never a unitary thing, because it actually was labeled with that name by critics and possibly by Pietrangeli, who was a scriptwriter working with Visconti on Ossessione. So it was a name that was given to them. It wasn't a group. It wasn't like a school with the shared theoretical principles. All the filmmakers had their own way of making films, which had some similarity, some things in common, and those can be listed in a minute. I'll get to that. But really, the reality was that the only thing they all share is that there are no rules, and that's, I think, the main thing to remember, that and that they wanted to represent the lower classes of Italian society of the time, which was basically the 80% of the population. So what it did bring to the center of the scene problems and characters that hadn't been seen before. That definitely is something in common to all of them. So we have unemployed people, pensioners who are unable to survive, farmers who organize their first strikes, women from the working class, fishermen speaking dialect. There's a depiction of characters that hadn't been on screen before, because before then we only had basically two genres: the white telephone dramas, which were these very lavish films where there were no problems that were present. There was no political, social, religious problems whatsoever. And it was a distorted version of the reality, or historical, triumphant films. Anything other than that was considered pure propaganda. So in a country coming out of 20 years of dictatorship, fascist dictatorship, obviously, as soon as that breaks down, you have all these voices that had been contained and nurtured by fascist Cinecittà, or being against it, working together or not together really, but working in their own ways through the freedom of expression, and finally being able to tell the stories of the people that hadn't had a chance to be told before.
And so when we come to, when that, I don't think I can express quite forcefully enough how immediate this is with Roma Città Aperta.
Oh my goodness. When you look at the date, it's crazy. I couldn't believe it when I started looking in detail at the dates. So the initial idea took shape in discussions in August 1944, and the Allies had arrived in Rome on the 4th of June 1944. So we're talking about 3 months later. They are already sitting down, Rossellini, Amidei, and Alberto Consiglio, talking about starting the first pre-production on the film. But then Fellini was hired, I think, in October that year. The script is written between September and December 44. And in January 45, they are shooting the film, while the Germans were still in north of Italy. Like, if you think about, not only they had lived through this horror, but while the horror is still in the country, they are actually shooting this film. So there were people, allegedly, on the street, passers-by, that actually weren't sure if that was happening for real, because it was so fresh in their memories that they couldn't tell if it was real or if it was a film shooting, which obviously at the time it was nobody could really imagine how to make a film at that point, because Germans had confiscated all the filming equipment. Cinecittà, during the occupation, had been converted into warehouses that were been promptly bombed by Allies. And then once the Germans had retreated from Rome, Cinecittà became a refugee camp. So, that explains probably going to the streets, because there were no sets. But then there were sets, because the second half of the film is pretty much all shot indoors in the Gestapo headquarters, which was actually basement that they rented in Via degli Avignonesi, it's called. It was used before and as a dog track. A dog track used to house the dog track, and then after the film, I think it went back to be that. The other interiors were shot in real houses. Electricity was erratic. There are stories about Rossellini stealing electricity for the shooting from the brothel that was on the floor above, or other sources say that it was stolen from the nearby offices of a U.S. newspaper called Star and Stripes. So there are a few myths obviously going around, but the reality is that there was not much electricity unless stolen. The film rolls, even then there's quite a few myths. So it was known that it was filmed on rolls of varying quality that were bought from day to day on the black market by cameramen, but actually then once the restoration work started at Cineteca Nazionale for the 50th anniversary of the film in 1995, it turned out that the original negative consisted of just 3 different types of film, so it's not quite as bad as they made us believe up to that point. One for outdoor scenes, and then 2 different kind of agfa films for the interiors. For sure, though, they were expired. That is probably true. But Rossellini did not mind that certain roughness to the image or the casting, or didn't even mind that the sound synchronization was poor. The dialogue was dubbed later, and all the sound was post-synchronized, as it was the case in most neorealist films. And he didn't have enough money to pay the labs to develop the film rolls during production, so there was no projection of rushes until the end of the shoot. So it's quite shocking thinking compared to contemporary production ways.
It makes you think how, because, there's nothing in this film that is evidence of that. You don't watch this film and make apologies for it and say, well, they couldn't deal with continuity errors because they weren't able to see, the film is, I can understand how fresh it was at the time, but I don't think there's any apologies necessary for it in terms of it's just so finessed. It's so well done. I want to come back a little bit to one of those neorealist points that you were making earlier. The one part of the film, which is, this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler. In a way, we could talk about these things a little bit together. First of all, Anna Magnani is one of the breakout star of this film, is becomes an international star as a result of this, and is phenomenal in her naturalism and in and of course in, spoiler, her heartbreaking death, which comes halfway through, and I always think it's the end of the film, but it isn't. You've still got lots.
It was shocking for the viewers of the time. It wasn't really something I'd ever seen. The main character dying halfway through the film. Like, who did that?
Yeah, but 25 years before, or no, 15 years before Psycho, we've got this happening. And I also think that scene is actually the thing that feels most sort of found in the film. It feels like you're just watching, and even though it looks like the shot of her lying dead on the floor, the priest and everything, it has the immediacy of something being filmed in real life. the obvious paradox to that is that it's also the most edited sequence of the film. It's the most carefully put together moment of the film.
Well, I read that they shot it in one day. They put aside 1 week to shoot it. In the end, they shot it all in one day, but they used 5 different cameras, mostly because it was cheaper, basically, that way, because you could have more possibilities in the editing, and that's exactly how it works. So it works really well, I think, like the results of all the different point of views, and it does build that tension that then to the climatic point of the when they shoot her. And it is, you're right that it does have that, conveys more than any other of the scenes in the film that sense of fear, I think, that was felt by the citizens, because these roundup. So to explain a little bit what's happening in the film, basically Manfredi, the communist leader, has been seen by spies, I guess, in the Prenestino area, which is the area where the quartiere, so the area where Pina Anna Magnani lives, because he went there to ask for help to, carry on his anti-fascist activities. And so then Major Bergman, the Gestapo chief, hears about it, and that following morning sends trucks of SS soldiers to round up all the people in the buildings to try and to take away all the men. So that's what's happening. But this actually happened regularly. So the people, I think a lot of the people in that scene that were actually just residents of the buildings that probably had lived through that, not like just a few months before. So that has a sense of fears, and the multiple cameras give that sense of urgency of the run that leads to the final moment. But also, I think not only is based on a real story. So Maria Teresa Gullaccio was shot in a similar way, but I've recently read in a biography of Fellini that Aldo Fabrizi, the character of the priest, had actually witnessed the shooting of Maria Teresa Gullaccio, who's the character that inspired Pina. So if you think about all he was really a comic actor cast against type, as Anna Magnani was. But if you those two in that scene are it's the most dramatic scene that you can think, and obviously probably also related to the fact that they had lived through that themselves.
Honestly, just talking about it, even discussing it like this in a podcast, exactly. I get a lump in my throat. I can't,
I've seen the film so many times, and now I've recently rewatched the trailer that the PFI post, because they are re-releasing the film for a selected UK cinema. Goosebumps, because they managed to edit that sequence without giving away the outcome, and I every time.
Yeah. And it goes to something else which is really, really fascinating as well, is the role of children in sort of neorealist films, because Marcello, the son of Anna Magnani, who is she's getting married that day.
Yes, I forgot to mention that little detail. Adds to the drama, yeah.
Yeah, and her husband is going to be taken away. But the night before, he says to the fiance, "From tomorrow, I'm going to have to call you dad." And the fiance says, "If you want to," and he says, "No, I do want to. I love you." And it's just like, oh, this poor kid is losing his mother and his new father all on the same day.
Yeah, I do feel there's a little bit of hope at the end, because his father, luckily, when the priest and Manfredi they get caught by the SS who are actively looking for them, he stays behind with the child, who's giving him a scarf of the mother to kind of comfort him, and he stays behind. And with that staying behind, he doesn't get caught. So there is a hope that he's leaving somewhere and he's going to find the child again, but that's all left to the audience to dream for after. So yeah, I also wanted to add about Anna Magnani. Sorry, before
yes, of course, yes.
So her, you mentioned her natural warmth, humility, or I don't know if you did mention, but she definitely has the humor and humility that assumes really the center stage, and this becomes definitely a career transforming performance and also kind of defining performance. So she was the perfect actress to play Teresa Gullace, because she's associated with her courage and her refusal to bow to the arrogance of the Germans. And she was actually the second choice, I found out recently, of Rossellini, because originally he had cast Clara Calamai, who had played the main character in Ossessione by Visconti just a few years before. But then she was under contract in the middle of working on another film, so Anna Magnani became Pina, and she had a stage act. She had a few film roles behind her. She actually had worked with De Sica beforehand with Teresa Benerdì, which in English I think is called Doctor Be Aware. And yeah, so she was cast against type, but she absolutely managed to use their skills for both comic performance, but also sudden variation of tones, and which is another side of neorealism. Often there's an exasperate variation of tones and emotionally violent scenes and just physically violent.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this sort of melodrama. There's something that always sort of bumps on the edges of melodrama, but without. I was watching, and especially towards the end, you're sort of thinking this is kind of operatic. It's going into huge emotions, and I feel the same thing of Bicycle Thieves and a lot of other Umberto D, a lot of other films which belong to this kind of genre or movement or historical moment. Aldo Fabrizi as well. There's a funny story that Rossellini would recount. I think it's quoted in Tag Gallagher's biography of Rossellini, where for one of the scenes, the interrogation scenes, he wanted to emote, and like actors these days, he perhaps wanted to create a Stanislavski-like moment where he creates the tears himself and he cries for real. And he was drinking grappa and trying to cry. And by the end of it, Rossellini was just like, oh, for God's sake, give the man some glycerine eye drops and let's have done with it. He was like very impatient with this guy. I don't care about this emotion. I just want you to look like you feel this. You don't have to feel like it.
And I guess he was, his roles really were more comedic after that. Well, it was only comedic up to that point. I think Fellini was actually quite crucial in the film because, first of all, it was involved in the film allegedly because Rossellini was trying to get Fabrizi, and Fabrizi was too out of his range. It was too expensive for him, so he used, possibly in a loving way, I guess, he used Fellini to be able to have Fabrizi on set. Once they did, though, because he had to accept a much lower pay than his usual. I think the relationship was quite detached. So Fellini actually ended up writing a lot of this. He was in his script. He was dedicated to Fabrizi because they had an existing relationship. They had worked together on many films. So he was the one that could really add those farcical elements, like the scene where he uses the pen to in the scene where in the roundup scene in. Actually, talking of variation of tones, there's this really dramatic moment, but then you also have the priest that knocks out the old man on the bed with a pen because he's trying to hide some weapons under the bed, and he's pretending that he's giving him this last.
And even with hiding those weapons, he has like a machine gun and a bomb, and the kid moves the machine gun and the bomb drops off the table and he catches it. And it's what we would call business. Exactly, yeah. It's a lovely bit of comic business in the middle of, as you say, this sort of life and death drama. Doesn't surprise me at all about the involvement of Fellini in those scenes as well, because even with the children, there's this almost like Amarcord-like dynamism between the dynamic, I should say, between the priest and the children when they're playing football, for instance.
Well, the ball, actually, I think is Fellini is credited with the writing of the scene with the ball falling on Fabrizi's head in the very beginning of the film. And the children, I mean, they're absolutely crucial, obviously, because also during the film they have this, we can explain, there's Marcello is Pina's son, as a group of friends that live all in the building, and they have like a parallel story, parallel action that goes with the adults one is these kids are like a gang really that carry out their own actions. At some point in the film, they make something explode, which causes quite a lot of. Actually, I think that is the reason why the SS go in that area the following days is possibly connected. Anyway, they have their own activities parallel to the adults. They are doing their own anti-fascist actions, and they're quite crucial because at that point, so these kids, if you think historically, they had in reality they hadn't known an Italy without fascism. They were born under fascism, they lived under fascism. That's all they knew. So there's this thing that they used to call the youth problem. So what will these kids do once the fascism is over? That's all they know. That's all they. So these kind of in the film, I think it uses instead of connecting them to the fascists, because fascism it makes them become an anti-fascist. So there's also like the hope that this youth problem would have a different direction after the end of the war. And also in the closing shot, they carry everything really. They've just witnessed the most horrific shooting. Honestly, still gives me goosebumps even thinking about that scene. And they march away from this side, and you have St. Peter's in the background. You've got all of Rome in front of them, and they're conveying this sense of hope for the future, but the hope is a hope full of despair, really, with the burden of what they've just seen, and grief and loss. But they also have incredible examples of courage and resilience of the adults that they were with them until not long before. So there is an anticipation, isn't that? But there is a possibility of a future ahead, and so they really carry everything with them.
I agree, and I think there's it's really interesting how nuanced it is in terms of that final scene, and in terms of the interrogation scenes. Every character is given reasons for doing what they're doing, even when they're doing terrible things. And even like the firing squad is it isn't monolithic or just monstrous,
Yeah, and that's actually based on, yes, exactly, sees some kind of humanity, and that really happened. So the shooting of the priests, because so there were two priests that the Don Pietro's character is based on. One was Don Morosini and the other one was Don Pappagallo, both anti-fascists, both had been in reality arrested and executed in 1944, one for supplying weapons, I think, to the partisans, and the other one for forging documents, which is both things that Don Pietro in the film does, and well, kind of. And they were caught after being betrayed by an Italian spy, or one of them was. But in the real shooting that was Don Morosini, that was shot like that. In reality, the Germans shot in the air, I think, rather than on the ground. And then there was the major or colonel or sergeant or whatever it was called that had to go and shoot him in the head, because they wouldn't do it. They could see the horror. They could see it was wrong. Like so there is a vague humanity there too.
One thing I want to say before we leave the film and we talk maybe about its impact a little bit, the number of sort of shocking, there is a real no holds barredness about what this film is showing. It shows drug use, it shows prostitution, it shows sex before marriage, out of wedlock pregnancy, lots of things that, even these days, Italian society might find in some quarters might find controversial. By no means all of Italian society, obviously. And torture. I mean, the torture scenes are explicit and they are gruesome.
Yeah, they are. I mean, you do see it just, I think, there's one scene where they're basically burning his skin. That's the only one where you actually see. The rest is kind of seen from a distance with the door ajar and the priest trying not to look or trying not to break down. But yeah, and as I said, that was the case for a lot of the people that worked on the film, or some Amidei definitely. I don't know if he was tortured, but some of their acquaintances had to live through that and died the same way.
When the film was released, what was the impact in Italy and what was the impact around the world?
So the film was shot, I believe his first screening was in September 45. So again, we have to think it was just over 4 months after the end of the war. The first screening in Rome was very disappointing because I think it was too soon, possibly, for audiences. They weren't ready to see those stories. They were too scorching, it has been said. It was too direct. First of all, that directness, as we said, hadn't been seen in cinema before, so it was quite shocking. And then the stories were their stories, and I think it got a bit overlooked at the first screening. But then in spring 1946, it went to Cannes, where at the Cannes Film Festival, it won the Grand Prix in Cannes, although Rossellini, I believe, was quite also disappointed with that, because he called it the Premio di Consolazione, like a consolation prize or something. Although, I mean, obviously with that, everything changes. It went to Paris, it was a sensation. It became the highest grossing film in 1946. Then it reached the US and the reactions were ecstatic. It won international recognition, and it was also it got an Oscar nomination for Best Script, although it lost to The Best Years of Our Lives by Weiler, which was also about consequences of World War II. And then from then it just never stopped because it touched really on experiences of war, which were common to people elsewhere and still are sadly common to people. And this really, that's why it gives the film this strong resonance with audiences around the world, and it probably will never stop, unfortunately, because there's no sign of wars ending ever.
No, absolutely not. Nor occupations, it has to be said.
Exactly.
I want to talk also a little bit about this season that you've curated at the BFI. So what can you tell us about this and how I know there's also you mentioned earlier that there's going to be a re-release of Roma Open City.
Sì, yes, sorry, sì.
Va bene, anche in italiano se vogliamo.
Benissimo. So, yeah, the BFI is re-releasing the film, as I said, in selected cinemas UK-wide, and this re-release is part of this 2-month season. So it runs through May and June. It will include 20 films. We're showing 12 in May and 8 in June. The June program hasn't been announced yet, but very soon I think it will go on sale at the end a few weeks. And the 20 films are films by 7 different directors, obviously Rossellini, Visconti, De Sica, the canonical trio. And then we have also a few films by Alberto Lattuada and Giuseppe De Santis, which I think are the 2 most overlooked neorealist filmmakers ever. And Fellini too, because there will be Lights of Variety, which is co-directed by Fellini and Lattuada. So there will be some, actually I had a look at previous screenings of these films, and as far as I could track down, one of these actually has never been screened in the UK, which is The Meal on the Po. Some other titles have, like The Bandit and Footsteps in the Clouds and Caccia Tragica. They haven't been screened for over 40, some 60 years. So they're quite rare outside of Italy. Luckily, there's a lot of new restorations, which we are presenting. We're also importing some prints from Cinecittà. And so we're working with Cinecittà, Cineteca di Bologna, and Cineteca Nazionale in Rome. Yeah, it's quite... I mean, obviously, it doesn't have everything because it would have to be much longer than 2 months. But let's say I've just tried to represent all the different aspects. So we've got the more traditional titles, more famous titles. We got as much as I could fit in of De Sica and Visconti, but also, as I said, Gestantis and La Tuada. I've tried to include a few crucial titles from them too, because I don't think they're very well known in this country. I think even in Italy they are often forgotten, as there was a big retrospective about La Tuada in Locarno, but in Amsterdam. But other than that, I mean, Il Cinema Ritrovato often presents the restorations of their films, but yeah, they're not quite as regarded as the other three names. And also, they represent a very important side of neorealism, because they, aside from the purist titles, directors, although not so pure because they also have their own differences, De Santis and La Truada are the ones that really include a bit more Soviet and American influence. Especially, I'm thinking of Bitter Rice by De Santis. It's completely different from the other titles that or like Roma City or De Sica. And so is the Bandit of La Tuada. They are very, very different, but equally neorealist titles. So, as I said, they should be named the neorealisms, because they are very different and yet part of the same label, under the same label.
In terms of preparing this season and curating this season, what have there been any sort of surprises for you? Have there been any moments where you've sort of had to reassess something, or something's popped out that you'd never noticed before?
Well, I think these last two names I wasn't really familiar with, apart from Bitter Rice, and I wasn't really familiar enough with their work. So I had to basically start from scratch. And I was quite shocked to find how they're actually really thrilling films. It was a revelation, really. I didn't really expect myself to find some neorealist titles of this kind, and so I'm very glad that I could include them, and I hope that a lot of people get to see them, because as I said, it's quite difficult unless you're in Italy. Even in Italy, probably just DVDs you can find out, but other than that, they're not watchable as easily as you'd like. So I find very refreshing. I found them very refreshing, actually, because we tend to just stick to especially in the UK, there's not much Italian cinema that gets, seen here, apart from the same few titles over and over. So it's it was quite shocking for me too, as an Italian. So I hope that a lot of people can come and see them. And also, it's just the pleasure of realizing how the influence, the massive influence that neorealism had around the world. You see, I structured it in chronological order, because I think to see how it evolved, it was the only way you could do that, really, to see how it starts with the precursors. There's 3 titles in the show, the pre-neorealism, and then how it evolves, and then the endings of how it kind of pans out. And we don't touch on the influences. We don't show any of the influences, but once you start looking into it, it's quite broad. It really had a major impact around the world. You could start listing them from the French New Wave to Cinema Novo in Brazil, free cinema in Britain, Mexican films of Buñuel, neorealism, Iranian style. In Italy, of course, had a massive impact on all the filmmakers that came after them, that started working on these films, like Antonioni and Fellini, but also from Pasolini, Bertolucci, the Taviani, Bellocchio, Taviani brothers. You had an episode of your podcast on them, Manno Olmi, but also to this day with Nanni Moretti, in some ways also Guadagnino and Garrone. It just never ends.
It's just like it sort of ends up dissipating into just cinema. It's just
everything, yeah. Because obviously maybe a lot of other movements that were influenced by, say, French New Wave, which in itself was influenced by neorealism. So if you go back, it just the list becomes quite quite long. And as there was a nice quote of Vino about classics, and he says that they always have something new to say, and really this applies perfectly to neorealism. And it doesn't matter how many times you revisit them, they just always have something to teach us, and they tell us a lot. And I feel like at this time specifically, the importance of freedom and compassion is so very needed.
And also the importance, perhaps, of sort of a socially and politically engaged cinema. You know, we've got a recent film out at the moment, Civil War, which the director seems to be at pains to depoliticize, even as he's dealing with very political issues. It's just like, come on, guys, I mean, you can. You can admit that you're interested in ideas which are about what's happening in the world at the moment without worrying about upsetting or alienating an audience.
Yeah, I guess possibly nowadays are not quite as ready to risk, like Rossellini risked everything, and even afterwards really became very adventurous, and but everything he did was a risk. But maybe that's not quite a contemporary trait in some of the filmmakers. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think it's so interesting that his career just goes in so many different directions, and he makes so many different films that to some degree feel like a natural continuation, and in another degree he's never ever repeating himself.
Yeah, and he really came to resent Roma Open City because everybody just kept comparing it to his new films to that. And he stated, well, you can't continue filming amongst ruins because people move on, the countries move on, cinema moves on, and we have to follow that. So obviously his work took a very different directions when still every time new films were released, even up to Journey to Italy, critics were disappointed because he had betrayed neorealism. But that was 10 years later, and the situation had changed. Italy was in a different place. He was in a different place. And, he started looking at emotions of middle-class people and feelings. And that's, but because, as he said, you can't keep filming amongst ruins. The ruins weren't there anymore. Luckily.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good thing. It's not scenery. It's not
Exactly.
the filmmakers weren't putting it there. The rubble was there because the American bombs and the German occupation put it there.
Yeah, although if we start talking about American support and getting the reconstruction of Italy, then that's also a dark side to that, I feel. I don't know if we want to go into with the Marshall Plan and
right,
Christian democracy and how that actually had a major impact on the end of neorealism. So definitely there is we can't keep filming amongst ruins, but also there is the censorship that comes from we don't want to hear your communist stories, and we are worried that this is propaganda that is gonna create too much dissent, and so let's just shut you all down so that you don't tell us your story. So yeah, I think you can't talk about the end of neorealism without talking about Andreotti.
Oh yeah.
It just really campaigned against any negative representations of Italy, of poverty, deprivation, and with this Andreotti law, as it's known, in 1949, it basically created a pre-production censorship where no film with any political content that represented Italy negatively would get any money. So that basically naturally led to the end of neorealism that can be considered, I guess one of the films that usually is considered the end of the neorealism is Umberto D. in 1952, but some say could be Journey to Italy by Rossellini in 1954. Either still, it had to end because there wasn't the support, and there was actually active boycotting of the government and the media for a lot of these films that luckily became really successful abroad. Some of them, like the Sica's films and Rossellini's films, but in Italy, they didn't really help the filmmakers when they had something to say.
Yeah, and if you want a contemporary sort of extension of Andreotti, the present government have just is using the public broadcaster RAI and is censoring historians who want to talk about the resistance and exactly the conditions that the Roma Città Aperta was entirely about. So, you know, it continues to this day to be relevant, and I would love people who are listening to the podcast, if you don't have experience of neorealism, to head along to the BFI and see the season, which is entitled
Chasing the Real Italian Neorealism. So yeah, I tried to translate the pedinamento as the chasing, because there is this, especially in Roma City, this feeling of like the chase. They're constantly running, they're constantly moving, on the move.
Yeah, from one bolt hole to another, from one hiding place to another.
Exactly.
Listen, Giulia, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you,
Same here.
and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for having me, and yeah, it's been lovely to talk to you. Thanks.
Arrivederci ragazzi, ci vediamo in un prossimo film.
Lo speriamo.